there's the intertwining of the different cultures here. So there's the military culture, there's the Hawaiian culture, and then there's the other subcultures that kind of matriculate from those. But we have to figure out how those are going to coalesce. And that's kind of, again, the complexity of how we have to manage that here in Hawaii.
Welcome to Richard Haw's YouTube channel, which looks at what we can do today to make Hawaii Island a more sustainable place to live so our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren won't be priced out of here and will be able to stay in Hawaii and live good lives here. Today, we are talking with Lieutenant Colonel Tim Alvarado, who is the commanding officer at Pohakuloa Training Area. That's the U.S. military training base located on Hawaii Island between Mauna Loa, Mauna Kea, and Hualalai volcanoes. It is known as the premier military training installation in the Pacific, and Lieutenant Colonel Alvarado was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina. He has a long history with the Army and was first stationed here in Hawaii from 2005 to 2008 at Schofield Barracks. In June of 2023, he became commanding officer at Pohakuloa Training Area. Welcome.
Great to be here. Leslie, thanks for having us. Richard, good to see you again. Always good to have these forums to be able to discuss.
Colonel Alvarado, you've said to call you Tim, so I'm going to do that. You're in command of a huge area. So the Pohakuloa Training Area, or PTA, consists of more than 133,000 acres. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. Equates to about 210 square miles. It's about equivalent to the size of Guam, the island of Guam.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. Wow. And tell us about the Pohakuloa Training Area. What is the area like, and what can you tell us about what goes on there?
We are the training area here for the Army. So the Army runs it. Of course, I'm an Army military officer. So when it comes to our responsibility, it is an Army garrison installation. And as you mentioned, Pohakuloa is a training area. We use it for all of our joint services across the Department of Defense here, whether it's the Air Force, the Navy comes here as well, Marines that come over from Kaneohe Bay on Oahu. We also have the Hawaii Army National Guard, the Air Guard as well, that train here. Again, it's not just a DoD training area. We also support a lot of our interagency and local partners. So we facilitate a lot of our first responders that come up here to train, firefighters that come up here very frequently when they have their fire academies. And that's in conjunction with the Hawaii County. We have a mutual aid agreement in place. We do some stuff that's specific to us that they aren't able to get anywhere else. And then also law enforcement officers. So HPD, the police department comes up here. We have training ranges, things like that for those law enforcement officers to be able to partake in, whether that's being proficient in their weapon systems, doing any kind of patrolling, training activities, K9 activities, or EOD. And we also have our special response teams, aka SWAT, folks that also come up here to train. Some of the training that our firefighters help support are some of the wildland fire training. We know that's very sensitive now, post last year with Maui.
There's a lot going on up there. My goodness. How many people work there? Now, is it right that there's only a couple of military personnel permanently there and the rest are civilians? How does that work?
We have a very small military contingent here, 4 active duty, 1 active guard, and everybody else in totality, we range around 175 civilians and contractors that work here in support of the installation. So really about 99% of my workforce is civilian, and all of those civilians obviously live here on the island. A majority of them are from here. Mm-hmm.
Now, my understanding too is that 23,000 acres of that area is leased from the state of Hawaii, and that lease is set to expire in 2029. So that's still several years off, but it does lead us into talking about the Kahoahoa project, which is what we've come to talk about that today. Last time here on Richard's YouTube channel, Richard and I talked with Noelani Kalipi, one of the people who organized and put together Kahoahoa. And here's how she describes it: bringing together Hawaii Island people of all types who have an interest in Pohakuloa. So everyone from cultural practitioners, veterans, lineal descendants, business people, hunters, litigants who are suing the Army, and the military. I've seen it defined as an effort to align local values with the military objectives to ensure all move forward together. This sounds like an enormous task to bring all those people together, and maybe a very daunting one. So Tim, tell me how you first learned about this project. What were your initial thoughts?
Yeah, and I think anytime as you're trying to bring big groups of people together, it's always a daunting and difficult task. By virtue of what the process is, and as probably Noelani had mentioned, the military is an integral part of this process. My predecessors started this initially 2 commanders ago, and that was kind of the legacy that was as part of that continuity. Again, one of the themes of the Kahoahoa is continuity and the enduring understanding of this as it's carried forward, regardless of who's here, and that message continues to perpetuate onward.
Richard, did you two know each other before you got involved with Kahoahoa?
There was a period where they had an open house,
Mm-hmm.
and that was not Kahoahoa, but we went up there to look, and it was really something to see how they were doing what they were doing, and the training that was going on and all that stuff. It was pretty amazing.
Tell me why you wanted to bring Lieutenant Colonel Alvarado onto your vlog today.
You know, I'm a person that doesn't take very long to kind of read who I'm talking to. And then once you get to understand where that person is coming from and what's inside of that person, it doesn't take me very long to figure that out. Tim is one of those kind of people. People who understand the bigger picture, the personal involvement, personal feelings, not just running by what you would think a military agenda might be. That's not where he's coming from. He's coming from doing what's necessary to take care of all the people. From the start to now, that's how I feel. That's who he is. I thought it was very important because that's what we're trying to do, yeah? Trying to get everybody to understand the bigger picture and where are we going? What can we do to make it a place where everybody can feel like their concerns have been heard? And that's why I thought it was so important that I, asked him if he would participate.
Tim, this whole Kahoahoa process is based on sort of a Hawaiian cultural perspective of how a group works together, shows respect to each other, works through issues. What have your thoughts been on that as you've become involved and seen how the group operates?
This process in itself is fantastic. In reality, something that's not really new, but in terms of new in the sense of the cultural implications of how we're approaching this process. And I think that's the important piece. It's the holistic perspectives that we have to understand, and at the foundation level, the cultural sense of everything that we're talking about. And I know Noe had kind of probably mentioned the nexus of how they came up with the name of the process. So Kahoahoa, to strike, to bind, to really come together. And there's kind of a nuance there in some of the interpolation there is strike, meaning kind of it may be some contention there. There's nothing that's taken in offense. But at the end of the day, it's kind of the old storming, norming, forming kind of process of, yes, we're going to storm at first. We're going to build that friction. But at the end of the day, as time kind of progresses, we'll eventually get to hopefully, at least the desire is to get to some sort of norming there, regardless of the history, regardless of that contention, that initial storming or friction in the beginning. So, and I think that's valuable, particularly in this day and age, when we don't have these types of forums readily available to the collective community, because I think, in my opinion, again, this day and age, civil discourse is healthy. It's healthy for us to be able to have this conversation. It's healthy for us to argue so that we can actually see the perspectives of everybody, to be able to empathize with all the different parties. And I think that's the key there is that level of empathy, to be able to sit in somebody else's shoes or stand in their shoes and be able to look through their lens of where they're coming from, and then taking that into consideration.
I was talking personally about Tim as a person, but I'm a Vietnam veteran, so I have a good feel for what the Army is like. Throughout my years in the service and all my experience, the Army is always worried about taking care of the people, just in general. So that's kind of my sense to start off with.
And that's what you're seeing with Tim.
Oh, absolutely.
And Tim, when you say this process is not unusual for the military, but is this different in the way it's being done?
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely different in conceptual sense of bringing in community. There is that aspect of, as Richard is alluding to, focusing on the people. And it's not just the military, but it's also the community aspect, because we do have impacts of everything that we do with the military and the adjacency that military installation brings to those communities. So that installation, whoever that garrison command staff is, they do have these conversations with the community. But I think this is different in the sense, again, level of culture. There's an added layer of I would say complexity, but it is essentially complexity of, again, that underlying foundation of the Hawaiian culture and the impacts of how everything is intertwined in, for lack of a better word, the spirituality, the ties, the aina, the mana, and everything else, and how we tie those entities, those features, those things into everything. It is different. And I think that's what makes this process very interesting because you have to look at it in a different sense. You have to do a little bit more comprehensive look at things because everywhere else in how I've done it before, at least in different capacities, there was a level of cultural undertones, but not to this degree. I think it's even more valuable because it means more, again, not just for today, but it is the value of what preceded us and what also endures. And I think the stuff that we always have conversations about is the generational aspect moving forward in the multiple generations here to come. That's that culture.
Right. I thought it was really interesting down to the details that all these varied groups of different people sat down and worked on defining the words that you're all using and what these words mean to everybody. What do you think about that?
What we don't want to do is be constrained by a lot of we call them terms of reference, if you will. So how words are defined. And I think that's sometimes subjective, but we don't want to over objectify what these specific words, because it is individualized. Whatever we define aloha as, whatever we define as aina, there's not just one definition. There's multiple definitions, but we have to be able to visualize it. As we see some of the presentation of the Kahoahoa process, I think I had mentioned before, there was a display of the word aina, various meanings of what that word means to people. Again, it's not just one definition, it's multiple different definitions from different perspectives. And I think that, again, is the essence of what this process brings to the table, is that we're not confined or constrained by one single perspective or one single definition of what it is we're talking about.
And did you learn from that different aspects of, say, the word aina? And does that change how you think about the land, or does it change how you think about the issues around the land?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it is the learning and education process of what this brings to the table. Because I can admit I'm not a cultural practitioner for all things Native Hawaiian, but being able to hear that perspective from some of those practitioners of understanding things like the water cycle here, from the history and the actual lineage and some of that knowledge that has been passed down here from the island of how the water cycle happens here in the, I would say, sacredness, some of the actual impacts of how that water, and of course, as we mentioned, water is really the true essence of everything here as we kind of talk about this. And that's also part of the Kahoahoa process, is a lot of orientation around by water in its essence. But again, looking at it from that perspective of something that I wasn't really familiar with, knowing some of the science behind it, but adding that cultural flair and that kind of perspective, again, added to that additional broadened perspective of, again, I'm just using the water cycle example, but never even considering that up until this point of having that introduction from those specific practitioners or those folks that are well versed in that knowledge for that particular subject.
Well, that's good then. And Richard, you said you have become a part of the group that is focusing on vai or water. Tim, are you also part of certain focus groups, or are you floating amongst everyone, or how does that work?
A little bit of both. So I'm focusing on co-stewardship. That's my primary working group. I believe I am a co-member for the vai working group as well. But going back to the stewardship working group, I think that one is one of the critical ones. And my partner with that is Moses Kalipi, who grew up here on the island. And I think our charter is to figure out, what does stewardship mean? Again, there's not going to be one single answer. There's going to be various degrees of what stewardship means for us. There's different perspectives of how people see stewardship or even co-stewardship and what that's looking like. But for us, our goal and objective is to figure out what that definition means in the various scopes of different categories of co-stewardship, whether that's in the cultural sense, the natural resources sense, the training aspect of the military, or what have you.
I was going to ask you, co-stewardship, what does that mean? But I guess that's the whole point, and we'll have to get back to you about that.
Yes, TBD, TBD.
Yes, okay. And I was very interested to learn that as this Kahoahoa process started, the rule was that when you gather, everyone just uses first names. There are no titles allowed, which I think is really interesting. What do you think about that? And how does that impact everything?
That's fantastic.
You have a good title, you know. What does it mean? Do other people know who you are, or are you just some guy named Tim from the military?
Yeah, well, they see my face everywhere, so they kind of know who I am. But it's actually advantageous because then I can actually call the general officers by their first name, and I won't get in trouble. So, but other than that, I think that's valuable. Again, I think everyone that leaves their rank in their titles at the door is important because we do some points use some of those titlings and positions as an advantage. And in this case, no one should have any advantage over anybody. It should be a level playing field. Again, everyone kind of generally knows who everyone is, but in that sense, it tones that down to a respectable manner where there's not a hesitance or a resistance to be able to speak whatever it is you think you need to say in your personal opinion, regardless of who's in the room. Particularly for the military, there's a level of respect and understanding of where that perspective comes from. Even though there are several senior officers in the room, that opinion is still respected because the rules of engagement are set, that there's no titling, there's no fear of retribution or anything for that matter. And again, I'm just talking the military side of the house. But I think that's important because everyone's voice matters, regardless of who you are. And that's something that we always say. And again, I'm just kind of going into the military vein that every voice does matter to the lowest soldier. And sometimes that kind of can make the difference. So that's where I think this process benefits it because everyone's voice, whether big or small, could be the ultimate impact of how this goes forward in the future. So,
well, that's interesting. How about you, Richard? Now, Tim was talking about from the military perspective. What do you see when you sit in this room and you see people from the, civilian side and, everyone from hunters to business people to people suing the Army to military? Do you think just using first names is changing how people interact?
Yeah, I do. It makes everybody feel like what they have to say is as important as anybody else has to say. I was talking to a person that was sitting next to me, and I didn't realize until much later that he was a brigadier general. Oh, okay. But the conversation was just straight up, and the things we had in common were the things we had in common. It was this human to human kind of a thing. It's very impressive to me from where I sat, trying to make this thing work for future generations. I felt really good.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Tim, is this all about the future, or is this impacting things now too? How do you think this will have an impact on what happens at Pohakuloa from your perspective?
So both. It is an ongoing process. So as we continue to learn through this process, I think this will ultimately impact what the future is for really, hopefully, more things than just PTA across Hawaii. And maybe we set the precedence for other things on other locations, maybe on Oahu, maybe in Kauai, Maui. But ultimately, it is a learning process, and it really is a work in progress. It's a continual work in progress, and it is to endure in perpetuity. So as we leave or folks move on or whatnot, this process hopefully endures beyond any single person, in that we can start to achieve potentially some of these mutual objectives that we are discussing in the individual working groups, whether it's VI, whether it's stewardship, and it becomes a continual refinement as well. Again, as we evolve through, whether it's an environment, the situation, the strategic environment, there's maneuver space to be able to adjust, to be able to update, to be able to reconsider or things like that. And I think that's, again, the continued continuity of this process. As again, we don't know what's going to happen in a year. We don't know what's going to happen in 10 years, but it should be something that continually evolves and that we can continue to provide input to it and make those significant outcomes in the end.
Yeah, it's great about continuity. That to me sounds different. This is not just one group of people. This is something that as people change, this whole process continues. That's great. And so you said something that interested me there. So in these little focus groups, you're actually talking about projects or things that might change, specific things that there are concerns about that might be put into place?
Yeah, and again, like as every meeting, there should be objectives. Otherwise, we're just talking. Not that we're making certainties, but there is a goal for progress, and I think that's what everyone is wanting. The intent is the communication. Ultimately, the communication will lead to an objective, a mutually understanding objective. Multiple different avenues here is where do we get to that norming phase, if you will, and maybe set aside some objectives that we can come together in, whether that's co-stewardship, because we really can't define co-stewardship, again, just from my working group, without identifying those objectives, again, from those varying degrees of how we define stewardship. So we have to be able to put something, a mark on the wall that says, here's an objective of what co-stewardship means in this category. And then we strive to reach that. And then if we do reach it, then we add another objective or goal down the road. Purpose of the Kahoahoa is that conversation, but within that conversation, there are kind of those objectives.
The general feeling of the direction we're going in, I'm really happy about that, because I always look down the road. Hawaiians used to look 7 generations from now, yeah? That's kind of how they look down the road. And I'm always looking for what can we do for future generations. And that's where we're going. And that makes me feel really good.
From Rich's background as a veteran and me being in the uniform now, I think that's, again, the future is the important piece to us. And from our perspective of what we provide here, ultimately, it is the readiness for the next generation of soldiers. But in tandem, there is also the future generation of how we are coexisting, co-stewarding, because the land ultimately for us, when we talk the Aina, when we talk the land, what this garrison, this installation, what Pohakuloa provides readiness for our troops, for whatever the environment puts in front of us. Again, it's that preparedness and readiness for those individuals, those local community members, those neighbors, those brothers and sisters, sons and daughters that are out there, getting them ready for whatever that fight may or may not be. And that's, I think, ultimately at the end of the day is what's important. The generational aspect of this, to be able to have this conversation so that everyone has those perspectives, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, thank you for joining us today, Colonel Alvarado. It was very interesting hearing about Pohakuloa and Kahoahoa. And I am interested in learning more about how this project goes. So maybe we'll have to have you and Noelani Kalipi back sometime in the future to see how it's playing out. And thank you everyone for watching. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Richard Ha's vlog. Ahui ho.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Leslie. Appreciate you guys.
Okay.